We made this.
Hello and welcome back to CHUCKYVISION, the podcast that deals with all things Chucky. We've covered the movies, we've covered the TV show. We're excitedly waiting for season 3, which is coming up this year. This is going to be a big bumper bonus episode. We're going to be talking about all things not Chucky. It's going to relate to Chucky in a way. Before we get into how complicated this could have been, or is, let me introduce my co-host. As always, it's Mark Adams.
Hello, that's me. You didn't introduce yourself, though.
And of course, I am Dev Elson. Good catch. Already a mess. We are doing, as you can tell from the episode title, we are doing Queer for Fear, and the subtitle is A Queer History of Horror.
That's actually a very good point, you know. Always at the start of an episode, it's like, what are we looking at today? But people have already seen the title, so why do I behave like that when I introduce shows? I realise I've made a mess of this even more now, but still.
Well, to explain what it is, there is a streaming service called Shudder. It is Netflix, but for horror, and they do original content. They did a 4-part docuseries. It was released September 30th last year, 2022. It covers all things queer in horror. I think we saw the trailer, or we just saw some of the news, but we saw that some of the guests, out of all of the guests, Jennifer Tilly was going to be in it, and also Don Mancini was going to be in it. And so we assumed, oh, they're going to be talking about Chucky, or they're going to be talking about, the sequels, like Seed of Chucky and Bride of Chucky, the queerer sequels of that franchise.
The gay shit.
Yeah. So that's why we put it on our list of bonuses. We assumed it was going to be about Chucky. Having seen it, it's not about Chucky, but it is a very good docuseries.
When it comes to what we look at in between seasons of Chucky, as long as it's queer or horror, but we've looked at stuff that just happens to have one of the Chucky actors in. It does still feel like it's relevant. I mean, Living with Chucky was a much more relevant choice, called Queer for Fear. It's about gay shit in horror, and that's been a huge focus for us when we've looked at particularly the TV series and Seed of Chucky in the past. So I don't think we've gone way off the beaten track like we kind of have with some choices in the past.
Absolutely not. And there are definitely connections. We do have some of the stars, not just Jennifer Tilly, Lachlan Watson shows up.
Yes.
Where we have, of course, Don Mancini. Chucky is shown. They never go into it in detail, but, we do see clips of Chucky. A lot of horror directors are inspired or influenced by other horror films. There's a lot of references to Frankenstein, and more particularly Bride of Frankenstein in the Chucky films. Bride of Frankenstein is a film that is covered in this.
I think at some point we should probably cover Bride of Frankenstein, actually, because it is so iconic to the franchise.
It is literally in Bride of Chucky.
And the first series of Chucky as well.
Yeah.
Before we actually talk about Queer for Fear, I had a look through Shudder, because it's a little extra kind of subscription series for me, just adding to my Amazon Prime. I'm not sure what it's like in the States, but I think it was like £3 or £4 a month, which is kind of peanuts. I paid more than that for a DVD of Dante's Cove. I'm so looking forward to Dante's Cove.
Really pushing that. Just snuck it in there again.
That's a tangent for another time. I think we should cover Dante's Cove. Moving on. But looking through the Shudder stuff, there's some really cool stuff, and I think I'm going to keep this subscription for a while. I have watched all of the Phantasm films since I got my Shudder. They're great. I've watched House, and I've been told that the House sequels are terrible, but I'm going to watch all of those.
House 2 is marvellous. House 2 is like, if House is Evil Dead, House 2 is Evil Dead 2. It's just way goofier.
Okay. There's a series called Dragula, which is basically RuPaul's Drag Race, but with horror makeup drag artists. Something that I am very interested in. There's 2 new seasons of Slasher, and I watched Slasher on Netflix recently and I was really blown away by it. Do you know what? I don't like adding extra money onto my Amazon. Christ, you have enough of my money anyway. But this one does feel much more worth it than something like BritBox that I literally subscribed to once to watch a bit of Doctor Who for another podcast and then watch nothing else I'm actually going to use my Shudder subscription, I think.
I love Shudder. I've been on it since it came to here in like 2017. I've been subscribed to it since. I don't know if they've done it at all recently, but I remember when the service was still pretty new and I was subscribed to it. Maybe it was because it was still new and they were rewarding early people on the service. I remember getting an email from them and they were like, thanks for subscribing. Here's a free year of Shudder.
What?
And they just gave me a free year of Shudder.
Gosh.
Yeah, that was crazy. And it's not actually that much because, as you say, it's not like Netflix. It's not a full, like, $10.99 or whatever it is now. So, like, a full year of Shudder is only, like, 50 quid.
It's worth having. You rent a horror film, it's going to cost you £3. So if you're watching 2 a month, it's actually worth having. And I've watched a lot more than that. Plus Queer for Fear. You can sponsor us if you would like.
Oh, yeah, they do sponsor things. I would love to be sponsored by
Did they? Yeah, sponsor
heard,
us. We'll watch even more of your shit. we'll find a link to Chucky for anything. I mean, we might do fucking Care Bears if I find a link to Chucky.
What is Queer for Fear then, if it wasn't what we expected? Well, it is similar. We thought it was just going to be more, I guess, dry. Seed of Chucky, it's a gay film, let's talk about that. You know, another example they use, you know, Bride of Frankenstein, let's talk about that for a bit. But it is actually so much far-reaching and vast than we thought it would be. I mean, it really covers the full gamut of not even horror cinema, but just cinema itself, from the very beginning to current day. The different periods and eras of how cinema has adapted to culture and how gays have adapted to culture, or culture has adapted to gays.
Yeah.
They say very early on about how cinema has a cinematic language, the way that audiences have read cinematic language, and the way that queers have developed their own language. They say, we queers have always had our own language. If you know, you know. Otherwise, it goes over your head.
Yeah, and it's not just in the States with that sort of thing. I think I've very briefly talked about Polari in the past, but a lot of the stuff in these documentaries talking about how you wouldn't spot the queerness if you weren't queer. The whole actual language that people thought gay people were talking in a foreign language when it was actually kind of like a weird backslang and usage of switching out words called Polari. That was broadcast on the BBC regularly in a programme called Round the Horn. Everyone thought it was nonsense unless you were queer and you knew what they were talking about, and it should not have been broadcast on the BBC. It was fascinating, and they got away with it because it was, I know this is a buzz term, but queer-coded.
And that is the angle or the perspective that a lot of these films get covered in. They are not as overt as we thought they were, like Chucky, a queer horror because it has queer characters in it. It's not that one-to-one. It's more how films and genres have been co-opted, and, you know, I mean that in the positive sense, adopted to represent and tell stories that aren't explicit in those movies. The story of Frankenstein, the story of Dracula, the story of these quote-unquote monsters who are the outsider, and how groups of audiences can relate to that in a way that other groups can't.
Considering how old I am, and considering how much I like horror, and considering that I have a degree in English literature, some of the stuff I learnt in this documentary, I was like, you should have fucking known that, Mark. I genuinely found these really kind of deep, analytical, brilliant set of documentaries. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
As you said, it's fascinating. There's a lot of cool history in it, real life history. There's a lot of cool behind the scenes Hollywood history. And there's a lot to learn in this as well as enjoy. It does both of those sides quite well in that factual, historical knowledge. And then there's also perspectives to understand and learn. A lot of these parallels, a lot of these metaphors and stuff, they're not one-to-one. If you watch Dracula from the start to the finish, he's the antagonist. He's the bad guy. You can't just say, oh, Dracula's gay, because then, oh, so gays are the monster then? Gays are bad? It's elements people are relating to. And so that's what's really interesting when you get some of these films, because you do see them in a different, they are subjective in a way. You do see that. You can see them in a completely different light. And then you can also, there's a couple films in this that when they talk about them, and I've seen them, and I'm like, where are you getting this from? Because I do not quite understand that. So there's a couple examples of that. But when you watch a film, when you relate to a film, when you read into a film, there's objective fact and then there's subjective as well.
Like I said, I learnt some new things about how queer-coded vampires and things are, but the more simple look at what vampires and Dracula are is the monster of the bisexual because, you know, he penetrates women and men, and the metaphor of the fangs being a phallus. They don't look at that because we all know about that metaphor. Felt like it was intelligent and it understood what horror fans would already know and wouldn't need spoon feeding. This felt like it just hit the exact right level, and that's a skill when it comes to documentary filmmaking.
Yeah, all of these guests come across not experts in the academic sense, but they know what they're talking about.
I like the choices that they make, actually. Writers and actors, but also lots of brilliant drag queens. And I'm a sucker for drag queens, so, you know, I very much popped for Ben de la Creme and Alaska Thunderfuck.
Alaska is the poster child. They're on the front of Griffith Fair. You know, that's definitely how they're promoting the whole documentary. They could have they could have promoted it with a boring academic to say, oh, this is a documentary about the history of horror, but it is about history, but it's about cultural history, and that is still as relevant today as it was back then.
I fully agree on that. You know how it is, documentaries you just kind of sit and watch, whereas I was actually compelled.
We've just explained why we love it and why you should go see it. We did actually have to do some planning because I felt that just going into this, not on autopilot, that was my phrasing, going into it just saying like, oh, I've seen this film, it's good. Oh, I haven't seen that film, it looks good. I think if we went into it half-cocked like that, then it would be a mess of discussion.
I thought we should embrace the chaos, but I listened to you and what you wanted, and I've behaved.
People have very helpfully put down all of the films referenced in this documentary on Letterboxd. There's a few lists. One was like 88 films, one was like only 30 films, which I think was like, you know, the main ones they really talked about. This one was 100, and it included all the films that are just briefly shown and not talked about. Yeah, we're going to cover what we've seen and what we haven't seen. I think, you know, something you were a little worried about was we don't want to come off as academics ourselves or scholars. That's not why.
No.
That's not why we're doing it. We're not trying to say like, oh, we've seen every single film in this documentary and we know how to talk about it. We haven't, and we're going to reveal how little we've seen of some of these. I've been watching some of them over the weekend. I think maybe you have, but like, I think both of us.
No, I watched Phantasm instead. But I plan on watching some of these films.
I definitely plan on watching some more of these, and that, I guess, is a point, if not the point, of the documentary.
So when I was watching Phantasm, because of what I'd learned and understood from these documentaries, I was looking for gay shit. No.
I don't know. Maybe. It's very male orientated in that. They're all women, but
you can't even ship the main characters because, you know, he was kind of like an uncle before he was a friend, and that's yuck. And the main character does have a terrible, terrible failure with women, but he is always after any of the women in it.
He is, yeah.
There's no queerness in Phantasm.
Phantasm 6. Maybe the tall man can get some.
Oh, dear.
He loves balls. There's your metaphor.
Oh, there you go. Angus Scrim loves balls. But yes, going back to your point and actually agreeing with it, there's so many films that I haven't seen that this documentary told me about, and I was like, shit, I have to see that. Particularly lesbian vampire films. I mean, they're going to be great fun. I didn't even know about them.
We're going to go episode by episode. I'm going to list all of the big films that they talk about. Then we're going to go through, if we've seen those films, we can talk about those. If we haven't, then I suggested we just bring up some films that are similar to those, you know, films that we've seen that we think might relate. That is a fair point about not having seen everything. I would be surprised if anyone listening, if you looked at this list, how much you've seen, because, I mean, it really covers, like, from the 1910 Frankenstein, the silent movie, all the way to, like, you know, 70s European lesbian vampire films to 90s femme fatale films like Single White Female and Heavenly Creatures. Like, there's a huge variety of films in this that I doubt everyone has seen everything.
It would actually be kind of like a fun thing to start at the start and watch them all one by one. Yeah. I'm not going to do it though. We did chat about, that'd be a really good idea for a podcast. We've already got a podcast. I haven't got time to do another one.
How many of the 100 on this list have you seen?
It is a shocking 25. 35. Not that many.
That isn't too bad because I've only seen 32.
It doesn't surprise me that you've watched a few more than me. Yeah, it could have been worse. It could. I mean, some of the films were things like Bound, which I hadn't watched until we started this podcast, but still.
No, I have seen quite a few of the early ones. I've seen all of like the Universal horror films and some of the black and white films like Cat People. You know, I think we've both seen a fair bit of the 80s horror films.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely some genres like the 70s vampires, earlier like 50s sci-fi films.
Some of them are going to be tough to find, I think, actually.
Because I've been looking for a bunch of them, just ones that interest me. Some of them are readily available, some of them I've had to hunt down. But again, you know, that sponsorship. Quite a few of these I have seen on Shudder. Whether we've seen them or not, let's get into Queer for Fear. Episode 1, they don't have titles, is about the very beginnings, Gothic fiction, literature, and how that informs the very first taste of horror in the earliest beginnings of cinema itself.
What struck me about this was the very, very first thing they were really looking at is queer people as the monster. But because queer people didn't have anything else by way of representation, that's why we are drawn to horror. That's where you see the queerness. I think I kind of agree, because I was always fascinated by vampires as a kid.
Even sexuality aside, even identities aside, you can really tell, even as far back as, you know, this classic literature, Frankenstein, Dracula, Dorian Gray, times of stricter morals back then, you could say. They're going to get into the Hays Code and how that affects Hollywood eventually, of how bad guys must be bad guys and good guys must be good guys. Characters like Frankenstein and Dracula, you shouldn't relate to them fully because they're bad guys, or quote-unquote bad guys, but they are characters. They're fully fleshed out people, and audiences can relate to them on some level.
The evidence that they'd found about Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker being queer, obviously we all know Oscar Wilde was furiously, publicly gay. The Bram Stoker stuff and the Mary Shelley stuff was fascinating. And the tragedy of Bram Stoker becoming homophobic to hide his own queerness, a story that could be anyone's story from around that time right up until now.
It's a really good start for this documentary because of the subjectiveness of cinema, the subjectiveness of literature, and the subjectiveness of real life. You know, the way historians have gone about not even outing, you know, they haven't proven that Mary Shelley or Bram Stoker are gay. They didn't find documents that say, I am gay. Heavy interpretations of diaries and stuff, real life documents, the real strong, passionate love they talk about of people of the same sex, and how it's that gal pals thing. They could just be good friends, but it does read like they're more than just good friends.
I mean, you could only speculate, can't you? But it does seem like the evidence is strong.
A fair bit more evidence for Mary Shelley that she was bisexual, and with Bram Stoker there isn't as much. Yeah, the documentary really goes into detail of some of those stories and the way they talk about how much they need those people in their lives. Like, Bram Stoker's wasn't so much that it seemed like he had a partner, but it seemed like he was in love with Walt Whitman, and that he really aspired to either be Walt Whitman or be with Walt Whitman.
I read it as unrequited love, from what I saw, but I really liked. Did you see the animation of the letters? That was cool. The production levels on this documentary were very, very good. Actually, the theme tune was great. The titles on that were great. The animation of Stoker's letters and everything that they were doing looked really, really good. It clearly was done with a lot of care and some budget, actually.
Like the Mary Shelley letter. They could have just talked about it, but they had Alaska read it out in a dramatic form. You know, it helps put you in the headspace of Mary Shelley as she was writing it. The great little tidbit of a Tousey Mousey.
Yes.
It's one of those things where you think how people back then were super uptight, fucking coming out of weird shit like Tousey Mousey. Have you seen the original Universal Frankenstein or Dracula?
I've seen the original Dracula. There's huge gaps in what I have and haven't seen.
They're definitely classic films for a reason. There's definitely a lot to read into them. Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, even the sequels, I was going to mention those. The sequels are really good as well. He's such a relatable monster, isn't he? Yeah. I think to everyone, two people, a straight member of the audience and a gay member of the audience, they could talk to each other and go, wow, that monster was sympathetic, you know, I related to him, but they could be talking in a different way.
Horror films in general were more memorable in this period of time. All the horror icons are still iconic.
Absolutely, yeah. It's incredible how well done these early films were. A sign of how good the books were. Frankenstein is such an interesting metaphor. There's so much to the character. He's made up of different people, gay and transcoded.
Yes.
There's so many parallels that you can make with Frankenstein.
It's so old, but we've always been here, you know? We know queerness isn't new. It's just people are able to live their lives and be their true selves publicly, which was never the case.
To go into Frankenstein a bit, how many Frankenstein-related films have you seen? More modern ones? Because I was thinking how strong they hit it with these. Do these gay and trans metaphors with Frankenstein continue in later films? Is it still as strong? Can you watch... Who...
Sorry, I'm laughing because I'm thinking about the Kenneth Branagh one.
I was just about to say who directed that one. It was Kenneth Branagh's. All those all those parallels as clear in that film.
The only thing that was good about that film was the makeup on the monster. It was really bad.
It reminded me of the other revamp that happened around that time. Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. And how overtly sexual that film is. But I don't know if you can with Branagh's Frankenstein. Isn't he, like, shirtless when he makes... I mean, that's a very loose parallel, but it's a bit weirder. He's, like, shirtless and all lubed up when he makes Frankenstein.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's homoerotic perhaps, but I don't think it's queer. I think there is a difference between homoerotic and queer. Queer-coded is a bit more subtle, I think.
Kenneth Branagh's Frankenstein might be camp, but in a very straight camp. Like, it's funny, but it's like 2 minutes of him and the monster just slipping around. I don't know if that is meant to insinuate anything.
Moving on.
But I wanted to just mention a few other Frankenstein-related stories. The whole Universal franchise of Frankenstein all have really good films. Frankenstein and Bride are head and shoulders above everything. The third and fourth films, Son and Ghost of Frankenstein, are also pretty good, and they do some interesting developments of the story. They introduce a new character, classic Igor, that everyone assumes is in the book Frankenstein.
Which he's not.
This is where he comes from, the Universal films, played by Bela Lugosi. The fourth one, Ghost of Frankenstein, is probably the most interesting one because he has a broken body himself. People consider him a monster. He wants to put his brain into the body of Frankenstein.
Right, okay, good.
Even though people look down on Frankenstein, I'm doing the classic thing and getting them mixed up. Even though people look down on the monster, treat him like a monster, someone like Igor sees the monster in a different way, that he is strong and he is powerful. It is a desirable body in a way. And all of these characters, because they are like the sons and the brothers of Frankenstein in the sequels, and it kind of reminds me a way of how they are more respectable people in society. They are these esteemed doctors, conservatives, like lawmakers and stuff, how they want to in public restrict and oppress the outsider. But then there's always like one of those lawmakers. We have all these photos of you going to gay clubs, and it's they are relating to the outsider in private. They want some of that lifestyle, but they can't admit to it in public.
It's always the way, isn't it? Bram Stoker's work is incredibly queer, yet he was homophobic. It's obvious to me.
That metaphor of being in different bodies, the changing of bodies as well, continues in a fun little film I like. Have you ever seen Frankenhooker?
I haven't, but I really want to, having seen this now.
It's very fun, but it has some really interesting things. There's that element of the main character who becomes the quote-unquote Frankenhooker. They were just I'd say normal, a regular person. There is that element of them looking down on the hookers who are, living people. Well, I don't want a hooker's body, as if, they'd rather have death than come back in a different body like that. And not to spoil it, but there's some fun gender play as well, where the scientist, his body replaced by like a female body and stuff, and then Frankenhooker's like, I'm fine with that. I love you for who you are.
Nice.
And then similar in that sexual sense, have you ever seen the Udo Kier monster films, both directed by Paul Morrissey, Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula?
I've seen Blood for Dracula, but it was so long ago.
Those are similar in a sense to the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula, in a sense that they are way more sexual. And so the metaphors are, they're not queer, but they are way more sexual. Like, it's about sexual. Like, the doctor is making Frankenstein and his bride for sexual reasons.
I think I missed that completely when I watched it. And this is because I was incredibly naive as a young person. Almost everything I watched in my teens and early 20s, perhaps, I need to go back and rewatch and go, oh, shit. And you can be as intelligent as anything, but if you are inexperienced and, you know, you haven't really become more worldly wise, you will miss things because it's completely out of your wheelhouse. And as much as I was obviously already gay and looking at boys, and I'd not really encountered queer culture when I'd watched films like this, I'm going to be looking at things through a completely different lens just because of my life experiences. And this documentary really highlighted all of that to me, how, like, I would obviously spot stuff like that now.
As I say, both of those films are quite straight in terms of the actual sex. The male monster only has sex with women, and the bride only has sex with men. There's elements you can read into it. Those people are different, but they are built to be apex sexual beings. The Dracula film isn't as good, but like, I only mention that because of the how the sex is part of the plot. Dracula feasts on virgins. In this one, he can only feast on virgins. But he goes to Italy because he thinks, oh, they're all Catholic, so they're all going to be virgins. Then he finds everyone there is having sex, and he can't find any virgins.
Brilliant. Before you go on through the rest of the films, I've looked at my notes, and it isn't about the films at all. It's about my fan wankery over some of the talking heads.
That's good.
Have you seen Monster in the Closet?
I don't think I have.
It's a trauma film where the monster is explicitly gay, falls in love with a male protagonist. And he kind of like travels through space and time through closets and actually comes out of closets. Fantastic gay film. I love that Harry Benshoff, the writer, is one of the talking heads because that was actually a really brave film that only Trauma would go anywhere fucking near at the time in the 80s. I love that he's there. He deserves it. Elvira out of character can fuck right off. Not into it. Put her in the wig. Get her tits out for me, please.
Well, Cassandra Peterson is gay. We don't know if Elvira is gay.
Good, but still put her in her Elvira wig.
Just going from the movies and stuff, I feel like Elvira is straighter then.
You're right, I know. It is still weird seeing her out of character. She doesn't do it very often. Maybe that was the point.
When was this? Was this before she came out?
Don't know.
She only very recently came out. This may have been just before or just after, around the same time.
What I loved about the Elvira thing is obviously she was very much under the male gaze for so many years. This kind of booby icon was queer. I bet that fucking turned up a lot of straight incel noses. Do you remember Samantha Fox coming out?
Oh, you have to remind me of that one.
Samantha Fox was a page 3 girl.
Oh.
She had her tits out all the time in the sun in the UK. And, yeah, she came out. And I was fucking delighted.
Yeah, I wonder with Elvira, though. I think certainly a lot of people watched it for that reason. But I think a lot of the people you're describing, I think are more casual watchers. I think for a long time, Elvira's had quite a queer fan base. Especially a drag fan base. A lot of drag people love Elvira.
True.
It's an interesting take with Dracula because he isn't so much the sympathetic character. They talk more about Renfield and the relationship between them. I haven't seen the new film, Renfield, but from the look of it, that's more of a action comedy, and I don't think there's any queer subtext in that one.
No.
I don't know how old Renfield is meant to be in those films. It kind of makes you aware that Bela Lugosi was, I looked it up, he was 49 when he played Dracula. So, you know, he's meant to be immortal, but he's kind of an older man playing this. As
you're right.
As a lot of people in the documentary say, he was kind of an unintentional sex icon. He is very dashing. He's very handsome. Well, in a literal sense, as a vampire, he's preying on younger people in this. Younger men and also younger women.
Gently a gay stereotype, isn't it? The older man.
Yeah, and I wonder if you were to make, say there's new Renfield, write a queer film that sort of goes into that relationship, age gap. Like, I think that's such a hot button topic that I feel like mainstream media would not want to touch that. This idea of subtext becomes text. A lot of the more conservative people are like, nope, you can't even, like, if it's about age gap, it's automatically bad. And if you're making a film that even references the whole age gap thing, then you're bad.
Yeah.
So it's interesting for them to sort of bring it up with something as classic as Dracula, something that I never even really considered. This is a weird aside. Have you seen Scream 5? I won't use names. There's two killers, as there's always two killers. There was a weird online discussion I saw. Both of the characters, they're both Ghostface. They are insane. They're evil people who kill people for fun. I remember a lot of people bringing it up. One of the Ghostfaces is in their 30s. And one of them is, because we see them go to college in the sequel, they are still high schoolers. And that was a thing that people were bringing up. It's fine, they're murderers, but that age gap is weird. They shouldn't be together. So people were more offended by that than they were the fact that they were murdering.
Sigh.
I'm very interested in any form, just like a book or something, if they did that with Dracula. There is an age gap in the sense that he is hundreds of years old as well.
Yeah, well, exactly that, yeah.
That's how films like Coppola's Dracula, I don't know how old Gary Oldman and Winona Ryder were, that they really upped the romance between those two. She's reincarnated, so there's like eternal love. It's not about age.
None of these things that you talked about are particularly problematic to me. For me, the most gross one is Twilight. This man, who is 7, 8 times her age, sits and watches her sleep, and she's not aware of it. When she finds out, she doesn't go, "You're a fucking psychopath." She goes, "Oh, how romantic." And he's not a monster for what he does. No one really thinks about that because Twilight, sparkly vampires.
I did think of Twilight when I was thinking of modern vampire films. That's an interesting one with what the authorial intent, what intentional subtext the writer was putting into it, and why they wouldn't think that was gross. Because the sexual dynamics in Twilight are meant to be Christian values. The complete 180 to how Dracula and the old vampires were, in the sense that they don't have sex until they're married. So it's very conservative.
Yet I think they're much, much, much more gross than anything we've seen in any of these vampire films.
Well, I imagine the writer overlooked those gross values because in their head they knew, well, nothing is going to happen until they're married. But we don't know that.
Truly diabolical. There's a line, actually, I really love, an incredibly strong metaphor for coming out. One night with Dracula is worth dying for.
Yeah.
And it really made me think how drastic it is for some people. I think myself included. It was horrific coming out. The risk is worth the reward, regardless of what the reward is.
Yeah, I guess using that note, it's a different sense than what you're talking about now. But in terms of death and queerness, and I've seen Nosferatu the Vampire, the 1979 version by Werner Herzog. I know that the Dracula goes into like the Black Plague a bit, but with Nosferatu, probably at that time, a very unintentional parallel of this outsider, monster, freak who's desperate for love and desperate for connection, but people can't connect to him because he's different. He comes into a society and with him brings a horde of rats that bring disease. So here comes an outsider with alternative lifestyles who's bringing a spreadable disease into a main culture.
Yeah, that metaphor is not something we would embrace these days. But they did talk about how the queer was always the monster.
And even if unintentionally the monster, they bring stuff like disease and stuff. Nosferatu and Dracula. This Nosferatu, this one's 1973, so pretty the main 80s AIDS epidemic. It's not one-to-one because Nosferatu is Dracula. He is, in a sense, a bad guy, and he wants to take love by force. But that one is an interesting film because he really is shown as pathetic. Dracula, he hypnotizes women. He overpowers women with his presence. In Nosferatu, he's a little bald bitch, you know? he is pathetic in that visual sense. But also, in that film, when he approaches her, he has put Jonathan Harker into a trance. He's given him like brain fever. So he doesn't remember his wife and he doesn't remember anything. Yeah. And Mina's heartbroken. Dracula in this says like, oh, I'll bring him back. I'll bring him back to you, but you've got to give me the love that you give him. And so he doesn't force her. He just gives her this proposition. And Mina just straight up says like, I don't even give that love to God. That love is only for him. She just says no. He just leaves the room. It's hard to make the monster the gay. They are usually forcing themselves into situations or forcing themselves upon people. And so that's where, you know, those metaphors fall apart. Yeah. There was one little history bit that was interesting. I don't know how much you have to say about it, but I just want to mention the pansy clubs. and Prohibition.
Yeah, I didn't know about the pansy clubs, but they make a lot of sense.
Yeah, we were just talking about society and, outsiders entering society. But it is always interesting to see how we have modern debates about, like, drag clubs and stuff. Pansy clubs were all the rage back then, and it was very much similar things. It was men dressing up as women, it was women dressing up as men. You can see it in certain old films and stuff, like Jekyll and Hyde, or... Oh, they mention it in the documentary, but there's a great one where a woman really plays with gender dynamics, and she's, like, wearing a top hat and a suit and stuff. It's a great film. The same thing, drag clubs now and conservatism. It was the same thing back then. Pansy clubs clashing with prohibition, oppression and striking down on what people enjoy in society.
Yeah, the parallel is strong, isn't it? It's almost like hate is a consistent.
And that is how the idea of these monsters create, because the oppressors are the ones creating the myth of the monster, aren't they? They want to make the opposition into as much a boogeyman as they can so that they can stop them.
Exactly that.
And that kind of plays into episode 2, which goes a little bit ahead, and it talks about the pre-code Hollywood and how the Hays Code really came into effect of the moral panic. Wikipedia describes this as the Lavender Scare. Lavender Scare, not to go into a history lesson, but that was because a lot of the conservative lawmakers at that time, there was particularly one, kept saying in all of his speeches and campaigns and stuff that we're going to crack down on those lavender boys. Men dressing up as women, women dressing up as men, being together. That's not bad enough. Well, they're also commies. It's also McCarthyism. Well, like, they're bad in every way.
I mean, communist is a dirty word, isn't it? But queer people, at least as a stereotype, tend to be more left than right wing because the right wing hate us. I would never want to be called a communist, but I've got no problem with being called a socialist. There is actually a grain of truth in that, really. And commie probably is closer than they might have thought, even though they were kind of making it up.
We are not like Dracula, we are not like Frankenstein, but all of these issues coming about, it's like a Venn diagram, there's overlaps.
Definitely.
This episode talks about some of the famous gay and possibly gay people in Hollywood at this time. How much do you know about James Whale? Well, I guess you learn quite a bit about James Whale in this, but how many of his films have you seen?
I had not seen many, but I need to watch all of them. This absolutely captivated me. And I think there is a question on how gay did they mean it all to be, but it does feel a lot like I've almost missed a big fat chunk of queer history by not seeing these films.
Well, it depends really, because they talk about two main people in this episode, and one of them is very subjectively, possibly, maybe if you look into it, gay. But James Whale is gay.
Exactly.
But then it depends on his films. So we're talking about the main 4 of his filmography. His other films, if you look at like the ratings and stuff, not to say they don't matter, they don't come anywhere close to this quartet of films. So it's Frankenstein, Old Dark House, Invisible Man, and Bride of Frankenstein. Goddamn great films they are.
I've seen Invisible Man. I haven't seen the other 2.
And yeah, I definitely agree with you. There's an argument to be made about how even directors now, writers now, just because they're gay, you don't want to be saying like, oh, this is going to be his new gay film. You don't want to pigeonhole them too much, because I think James Whale was just, mainly just trying to make the best films that he can.
Yeah.
You can't ignore the fact a lot of the cast were all gay.
It's almost a nepotism. I don't see it as a negative nepotism of like a community looking after each other and protecting each other and giving each other work.
You do definitely get a sense with the history in this that these are people looking after each other in this time and giving each other good work. And my God, James Whale does really give some of these actors great work in these films.
And this discussion over James Whale, Don Mancini is there. It's the first actual direct link to Chucky, let's be blunt. And he talks about how the Invisible Man's gleeful cackle inspired Chucky, and then they compare the 2 laughs. And this is where we actually get a clip from a Chucky film.
I guess there's definitely a metaphor to be made with Frankenstein didn't ask to be remade. Certainly Tiffany didn't ask to be remade. That is very transcoded. Or even in a non-literal sense, remaking yourself to be who you want to be.
One thing that I got from watching this documentary was, as I've got older, I found it much easier to spot the gay stuff, the gay male related stuff in things. Embrace them and be pleased that they exist. But I still don't spot the trans metaphors, the trans subtexts anywhere near as much as perhaps I could, or how trans people would.
Having what I just said, like, I definitely do think these films deserve a different reading or a more in detailed reading, because certainly trans and gay metaphors, they're not one-to-one. They don't always make the same sense. In Frankenstein, the monster didn't ask to be remade. Very pointedly, the point of Bride of Frankenstein, the bride didn't ask to be made the way she is. So that is not the same transitioning, because that is a person doing that to themselves because they need to, they want to, purposefully becoming a different person. Whereas in Frankenstein, a lot of that is because someone else feels that they should be a person that they want.
Yeah.
I guess you could make that metaphor in the sense Frankenstein creates the monster and the monster creates the bride. They are putting their ideas of who that person should be on that person.
And I think later on in the episode, they talk about the deep pain of hiding who you are. And that is something I can certainly empathise with. It's just fucking tiring.
Yeah, and that really comes across. Even though the bride is only in Bride of Frankenstein for about 5 minutes, they reject their reality. They reject what they were made for. The act of making them, scientifically, does not relate to the transitioning. It's more the societal ideas of who someone should be.
Yes. Expectations compared to who you are is a big thing about being queer.
It's always a shame that we've never really had a good bride story. I mean, I love Bride of Frankenstein. I think it's like a perfect film. Yeah, we never learn who the Bride of Frankenstein is, like we do for the monster. There's maybe some parallel metaphor to be made. Elsa Lanchester plays Mary Shelley and also the bride. Yeah, Old Dark House and Invisible Man are great early examples because compared to what we've been looking at so far, these aren't classic monsters. They're not supernatural monsters. These are humans. Invisible Man has impossible science, but like the parallel of the modern Invisible Man, that is someone using science to act upon their base human instincts and to be who they want to be, but in a very bad way.
Yeah, very similar to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, actually, when you think about it.
Similar to that, we get into Alfred Hitchcock, the other main director of this episode.
Alfred Hitchcock, who, and I quote, could have been a poof. I just... Fucking hell. You can just imagine him saying that as well. He gave no shits. He was so completely confident that his films were amazing that he could basically say what the fuck he liked.
Hitchcock is a really interesting figure. I mean, I've never really cared about Hitchcock too much, but in context of this documentary, a very interesting figure because he never came out. No one ever really said that he was a flaming gay, that he was obviously queer. There is a strong sense of, similar to Bram Stoker, hints that he may be gay, all internally wrapped up in this sense of like a lot of his films have been derided by some as misogynist. He has, rather than affectionate, loving relationships with male characters, he tends to really put female characters through the ringer.
And it allows for a discussion on what is gay. Do you have to have consummated any kind of queerness to still be queer? If he's attracted to men as well as women, that makes him bisexual, or does he have to identify as bisexual for him to actually be bisexual? You know, there's this whole men who have sex with men thing that won't call themselves gay. I've always found that a peculiar thing, so I don't think we can call Hitchcock gay because it doesn't sound like he acted on any of his attractions. I could have been a puff rather than I've licked a dick. I wonder, there are so many identities and I'm all for it. I also take some real solace in the fact that I'm pretty dull and monosexual and just a gay man. I don't envy people who have a more complex thing going on with who they are. But if he never acted on it, can he be anything other than straight? It's an interesting philosophical debate, isn't it?
It definitely would not imposing any ideas, really. I don't know how much you know Hitchcock, but we're going off mainly what the context of this docuseries gives. I've never done a deep dive. That poof excerpt is, the most I know, really, in terms of overt stuff.
Yeah, me too.
I guess the most we really have to go off is that real interpretive stuff. How does he present men in his films? I guess there's something to be said that there are strong male figures, Jimmy Stewart is in a few of these, Cary Grant. But when you look at some of the villains, I guess more particularly, I want to talk about Psycho and Rope. The villains in those are not, I would say, affectionate, but they are twinks.
Anthony Perkins was an attractive, closeted gay man. That casting of him as a trans character is fascinating.
Psycho is one of those things like Frankenstein. He is a character where there is so much to read into. There are so many interpretations.
The whole Anthony Perkins story, I didn't know. Kind of heartbreaking. And I love how lovely and supportive and grounded his son Osgood was when telling his dad's story. When you hear the horror stories about how family can treat you when you come out, the fact that Anthony Perkins' son is on this documentary talking about his dad in a very positive way, that was nice.
I'm trying to think. I definitely knew about Anthony Perkins because I don't think there's a documentary made specifically on him. When I'm looking it up, this is what it comes up with, and I think this is what it is. There's a documentary on another actor, Tab Hunter, called Tab Hunter Confidential. I'm pretty sure in that, his son, Osgood Perkins, he shows up and he talks about Anthony Perkins in that. Because I've definitely seen a documentary where they talk about Anthony Perkins in a bit more detail. Yeah, interesting parallel with the casting of Anthony Perkins because also Farley Granger was also a closeted actor in Rope. And these are quite similar roles. The docuseries supposes Hitchcock would have obviously known these people were gay. And they play quite similar roles. They're both very fidgety. They're very fidgety, nervous characters who don't want to be found out for who they really are.
Yes. It's almost like he tried to cast people who would understand the role better.
Yeah. Psycho is an interesting case because as we talked about with James Whale films, in terms of these are more human monsters, yeah, there is nothing supernatural about Norman Bates. It gets into that more modern stereotype now. Gays got lumped in with McCarthyism. Now the debate of queerness gets lumped in with a mental illness.
Yeah.
Norman Bates being mentally ill is the parallel, is the metaphor of him being gay.
I thought it was more along the metaphor of him being trans, actually.
Both in a way, I guess. As a woman, I think he's still, kind of like Hitchcock, does not have strong views on other women.
Yeah. Yeah, good point.
Very critical.
That's true, actually. Yeah, the misogyny. You can be a female misogynist. And yeah, so the mum is the mum, but you know what I mean. Him as his mum is very misogynist.
Strangers on a Train was written by Patricia Highsmith, and Patricia Highsmith, she wrote The Price of Salt, which then became Carol. You don't really get it in the film Carol. Patricia Highsmith was the same thing. She was a very self-hating gay. Both of them are like, well, I'm in love, my love is pure, but all of those other women are disgusting.
You wouldn't think that it would be like a misogynistic woman, but it also, because it was a very simplistic look at a trans person and, like you say, suggested that very much that it was a mental illness, it was never going to be a positive, intelligent representation of trans people, was it?
It can never be one-to-one. As a metaphor, there's murder in these stories. And so the stories cannot logically go, he means well, even though he murdered people. Like, you can be sympathetic towards him, but he also is very much the antagonist.
Agree.
Have you seen the sequels?
No. I always kind of expected them to be a bit shit. They look fantastic. They have gone right up my my priority list.
I think Psycho is technically a classic. It's technically a masterpiece. But I sort of prefer Psycho 2.
Right.
It's a very decent follow-up. Psycho 3 is directed by Anthony Perkins. Even though there are 80s sensibilities, women get their tits out, there's more blood and gore. So, you know, stuff that wouldn't be in the original Psycho. Kind of clear that Anthony Perkins is directing it. The focus on Jeff Fahey. He is shirtless. He is so hot in that movie. He's the big focus. And he's a really interesting character because they introduce him at the start. He's picking up a hitchhiker, a young woman, pouring down of rain. It's late. Oh, we're just going to go sleep in the car. He wakes up, starts like feeling a leg, starts trying to kiss her and stuff. And you think, oh no, this film's going to start with like a rape. He's going to be the bad guy. He's still a dickhead. Like, she gets out of the car and he's like, whatever, bitch, and then leaves. Sure. But he's not a rapist. He is just like an alpha male, the inverse to Norman. In that if Norman is a quote-unquote beta, then Jeff Fahey's character is the alpha. And that's a very interesting parallel of Norman trying to, not even going up against, but trying to work alongside a more masculine man. Someone that I don't know if he aspires to be that, but there's definitely themes and ideas that come out of that.
Like I say, I'm really looking forward to seeing Psycho 2 and Psycho 3.
Yeah, they're solid films. Psycho 2, I don't know how much there is to read into Psycho 2. I think that's more of just a solid, it's a sequel. Have you seen Rope?
I thought I'd seen a lot more Hitchcock than I had. I've seen Rebecca, if that helps, but no, I haven't seen Rope, and I really, really want to see Rope as well.
I confess I haven't seen much Hitchcock. Rope is one of the films I've seen. They hit the nail on the head, but then also they don't show all of the film. And the film is much more of what they talk about in this. In that metaphor of them murderers and gays is really fascinating in this film, because the whole point of it is there's no reason to the murder. The main guy, Brandon, kills them just on a philosophical whim. We're superior to that person, and therefore they don't matter. So they kill him for no reason, and then they host this party, and the body is in this chest. Philip, the one who is played by the gay actor, he is much like Norman. He is fidgety and nervous, and he doesn't want to get caught out. But Brandon, at the whole film, is cocky, and he's confident. There's this whole sequence where Jimmy Stewart is their lecturer. He's like their professor. He's the one that incidentally, unintentionally got it into their heads about this whole moral superiority. There's this whole bit where Stewart talks about how murder should be acceptable in society. And he's like, cab drivers and rude people and stuff like that. You know, just obvious people, you know, landlords. And it's all very fun and charming. But it's quite an obvious metaphor of these high society people who are talking about the gays. It's that sort of talk, you know, like people just talking about the news, like, oh, the whole trans bathrooms and gay rights. Like, they're talking about it with a overt separation. We're not like them, but let's talk about it because it's fun. It's interesting to talk about them. Like, what if murder was fine? That would be funny. Then, you know, Brandon comes in and he's like, yeah, murder would be good. It should be illegal. And so it's this very one-to-one metaphor, this, of gay people hiding in plain sight. That kind of mix of some people are super nervous, they don't want to be caught out, they want to stay firmly in the closet, and then other people who are like, well, I'm not going to just come out and say I'm gay, but I'm really going to tease it. And I'm really going to get these people to admit being gay isn't bad. I want to get them to say that, and then go, well, it's a good thing you don't think gay people are bad, because I'm gay.
I kind of tried that with my parents, didn't work.
Yeah, the parent talk. It's very similar to that in this movie. Rope is a really fun movie to watch with that perspective. I'm
going to be watching nothing but stuff off this list for quite a while. Good job. I've got my Shudder subscription. Sponsor us, Shudder.
And so, to contrast the hiding in plain sight metaphor, we're on to episode 3, which is all about transformation and the outsider as an internal identity, and how that internal identity can transform into an external identity. We're talking about werewolves, cat people, body snatchers, as one of them puts, back and forth and the ever-changing middle. As some of these films go, there are werewolf films where people transform on the full moon, and it's quite rigid in when it happens. People transform at any point, whenever they want, you know, like Jekyll and Hyde. And there are films where transformations are gradual and then permanent. These films are definitely, they are about subtext, aren't they? They are about metaphors and parallels. If not, you know, not always queer ones, but they are about society and people.
Within the very first few minutes of this documentary, it hits really hard with some stuff that, whilst I think I subconsciously was aware of, but also just makes it so real. There was a line, when you don't see yourself anywhere, you look for what's closest. Fuck, I used to do that. It genuinely is getting more representative, better. I genuinely think it is getting much, much better for representation, and not just negative and positive, but just natural representation of everyone, really. It's a bit of a tangent, but there was a television program called Hetty Wainthropp Investigates, and there was a awkward, gangly, enthusiastic boy character in that I always fantasized as, because he was so similar to me in that way, that he was also gay. The character was called Jeffrey, played by Dominic Monaghan. I absolutely projected onto that character. The character wasn't gay at all. When you don't see yourself anywhere, you look for what's closest. My crush on Dominic Monaghan all comes from the fact that I projected myself onto a character he played.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And we've been talking about that the whole documentary. We've been talking about the whole episode. In this episode, it's really where it comes the most intentional in these films. We've talked about how people might relate to Dracula or Frankenstein, but those are singular characters. They are their own being, aren't they? With their own story. Lon Chaney Jr. plays a character in The Wolfman, deliberately much more a film where you are meant to place yourself in that position.
Yeah, and so the beast, the animal within us, can be literally anything, can't it? It can be a killer instinct rather than a queerness, or it can be something a lot more sinister than your real self. Whilst it is a metaphor for queerness, the beast, the animal within us, doesn't have to be queerness.
Yeah, certainly when they look at the Body Snatcher films, a continual reboot. These are different generations reflecting their own society and how oppressive and normative society cultures are taking over. The 50s and, communism and all that, and then the 70s, it's sort of the sexual liberation being repressed and destroyed, and then the 90s is the whole military complex and the idea of the constant war and stuff, and we need to be serving our part. They all share a similarity in those films of like the ideal of American culture. In that sense, Body Snatchers works well, and it works differently than a lot of these other films, because The Wolfman, Frankenstein, Dracula, they are all ostensibly the bad guy, and you have to relate to the bad guy. In the Body Snatchers, all of those films, the one thing they have in common is that the antagonist force is the normative ideal of American culture. And the good guys who are trying to survive this wave of oppression are the people who want to live their own lives and live their own identities. It's a rare franchise where we're represented as the good guys.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm going to respond to that because I haven't actually got anything to add with Ben Delacreme's outfit was fucking fabulous.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But again, I think it is worth a gentle highlight of some of the talking heads. Every single one made sense. And it wasn't really a criticism of Living with Chucky. I did feel like some of the talking heads in that were picked because she could get them rather than she should get them. There was some justification in the director's commentary. I just think everyone was exactly on point with who they got for the talking heads on this.
I didn't credit them up top, but I should credit the creators of this. It's far more professional, but it is in the same way as sort of who you know. Yeah, this was executive produced, co-directed, and starring Brian Fuller. It was also created by Sam Weinman, and there was additional directing and writing producing by Tom Maroney and Tara Anais. I know that Phil Nobile Jr. helped produce it, and he helped produce a few other documentaries on Shudder. He is the chief editor of Fangoria. So, in a same sense with Fuller and Nobile, it's the same kind of sense with Kira Gardner. These people just know way more people because they are notable figures in horror. You
wouldn't have made that documentary if you weren't able to access that kind of thing. Similar thing to Living with Chucky, I guess.
I have no idea to base this on, but I assume people in Living with Chucky did that just because they were friends with Kira. Yeah. Whereas in this, I assume everyone on camera was paid. So this was also a job.
Everyone would have been paid for this, yeah.
Yeah, you're all right about a lot of people getting representation in this. And it's great to have a wide range of people being covered in this. Yeah, and it's like those Body Snatcher films. It's all about identity, different people coming together in a sort of community. I definitely wouldn't want a modern Body Snatchers film to be about this. But I do find it kind of ironic in a way that the whole cultural landscape at the moment is the inverse talk of this. Conservatives are talking about this oppressive culture of like, the trans people are trying to take over. The gay people are trying to take over.
Sad, actually. Very sad.
Yeah, the whole werewolf talk is really interesting. Like the Wolfman and then cat people, particularly cat people. These animals are portrayed as scary or dangerous. And it kind of reminded me, because it's not they're just becoming an animal, but less so with Wolfman because he's his own thing. But with cat people, the idea of they're not going through this alone. There are other people who are already cat people who are, and they talked about the original film. There's a strong themes of lesbianism, and in the 80s one, Malcolm McDowell is someone who wants women to really accept that the cat people, the pamphlet within them. It reminded me in a way of like the stereotype idea of gay bars and drag shows and S&M clubs, that they are in media presented as strange and dark, but like alluring. Do you know what I mean? It's like a different world. But then in reality, it's the same thing of like turning into the Wolfman, like that's scary and dangerous and different. But to them, the reality is those are safe places, safe spaces for those people.
Yeah.
When you are the Wolfman, you're not hiding who you are on the inside. And when you go to these places, you're not hiding who you are on the inside because everyone is free to be the cat person or be the wolf man.
Surely the writers and directors must have been aware of the metaphor of werewolves and the metaphor of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, even though kind of demonizes your true self. They must have known what they were writing. They were intelligent people.
I want to get into this because this is something I kind of had qualms with. Have you ever seen The Howling?
Yes, great film.
I was going to say, I love that film as well. But in terms of the talk of, do the writers know what they're writing? I do not think The Howling is a positive representation. The idea of, people being who they truly are is good and positive. But in The Howling, that community of werewolves are very much the bad guy. They are forcibly converting the main woman into being a werewolf against her will.
Yeah.
One of the main werewolves is literally a serial rapist, and he does it because he has no danger of dying. Like, he knows he can get away with it. And the community just accepts that. I understand that they use The Howling as like a metaphor for like the transformation of being a werewolf, but I think the community of werewolves in The Howling it's a very negative portrayal if you're going to make that parallel, because it's very much that weaponized idea, stereotype of gay communities that they're all groomers.
It's definitely a queer community, but you're right, it's not a positive queer community. Yeah, I agree. And that goes back to what we were saying at the top of this episode. When you don't see yourself anywhere, you look for what's closest, and you may suppress the bad element of that queer community because it is the only queer community that you can see.
It definitely is a case. I think that was really an example for me where, similar to Norman Bates, like, oh, he could be positive trans representation, but he's also a murderer. This is very much the same case of cherry picking. They showcase that bit at the end when she transforms on live TV in front of everyone. They contextualize that as a positive. This is someone who has a figure on TV in culture. People know who they are. People would trust that person. And then they're coming out going, we have another side to us. It's inside all of us and we need to embrace it. In the context of Queer for Fear, they kind of represent that as like a positive. But then in the context of the film, she gets mercy killed right after. Like, she does not want to be a werewolf. She's showing that as like a danger, like, they turned me gay, watch out, they'll turn you gay as well.
Yeah, you're right.
The important thing is, like, as you said with that quote, you've got to find what you can find. It's important not to put too much of that on a film where it's implicit or implied or not even intentional. With that kind of story, like, I love Joe Dante as a director, but I would never say Joe Dante was intentionally being homophobic when he made The Howling.
No. I absolutely don't think that was his intention, no.
Clearly it wasn't his intention. I don't know if even the themes of them being gay, a gay community, was his intention. I think that's just an important note to make when looking at these films. When looking at Hitchcock, we don't know if Hitchcock was gay. We don't know if these characters are meant to be gay. It's fun to watch a film with a different lens, with a different perspective, but it's important not to go into that film expecting it.
Yeah.
Like Rope. There's the whole metaphor that murder equals gay. Don't watch that film expecting Jimmy Stewart at the end to be like, you know what, guys? Murder is okay. I think you guys are swell. Like, that's not going to happen because the metaphor, it doesn't make sense. I think, though, a werewolf film that does work better in terms of metaphor. Have you ever seen Ginger Snaps?
Yes.
That's definitely a film where the subtext is intentional and also borderline text. Yeah. The subtext is the text, really, with Ginger becoming a werewolf, and it's very much about feminism, not so much about queerness. Definitely that sense of transforming into something that people might find monstrous, but Ginger, because she's experiencing it, it feels good to her. Like, she wants to become this.
It's explicitly lesbian. That's not what we've been looking at before with all the previous films,
Yeah, there's definitely ones for both Ginger and the sister. They kind of throw in that she has like a boyfriend and stuff, but like there's a very funny joke, and I don't think the sequels are that good. But in Ginger Snaps too, they do show that joke when she's talking about becoming a werewolf, and then the therapist just writes lesbian on her notes.
Yeah, that's a nice line. Well, not a nice line. That's a nice scene. I like that.
And that's an interesting film as well, because that's a different kind of werewolfism. It's not the idea of that you can become a werewolf at any time. She is just becoming a wolf.
There's lots and lots of horror in this. There's lots and lots of really gruesome werewolf transformation. But for me, the thing that I found the most extreme and scary and shocking was the footage of real shock treatment, because that's not special effects. That is people being tortured because they're gay. And that will always be more extreme and scary to me than literally anything that any film could ever do.
Yeah, definitely. They do show the 2010 Wolfman, don't they? As one of those examples. Yes. I mean, that's not a great film, but like that's an interesting scene. These scientists, these these modern men in that society at that time, they don't believe he's a werewolf. They just think it's a sickness of the mind. And their way of fixing it is with quite horrible scientific methods of the time.
Yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it? I've gone into this with when there's the shock treatment in Chucky. That will always be, forgive the pun, more shocking to me than any kind of blood, guts or gore. Even like torture horror like Saw, it's just not the same. The other thing in this episode that I really liked was the real kind of insight into the queer 50s in America. And this feels like an LGBT history documentary as much as it is a horror history documentary, and I'm all for it.
Yeah, no, that was a great inclusion because that was something I hadn't noted. One of those, subgenres that I had definitely not seen much of was the 50s transformation movies that they talk about. That I was a teenage werewolf and I was a teenage Frankenstein and all that. We talk about the classics like Dracula, films that a lot of people have seen. I really like that they really show how smaller films, cheaper films were being made to sometimes cash in on a craze, but also there are people within those films, cast and crew, that are telling their stories to smaller audiences, but it's still nice that it gets remembered in retrospective documentaries like this.
And the only other thing that this particular episode inspired me to ask was, is every single horror film a metaphor?
That is definitely the cultural debate that is coming up these days a lot more in I know this isn't the one film to do it, but a post-Babadook landscape. It feels like every horror has to be a metaphor. The director or someone has to at least explicitly say like, yes, my monster is a metaphor, and this is what the film is about. Generally, I prefer films to be more interpretive. Could a film be a metaphor, or is it just its own story?
So let me put this to you. What is the metaphor in Evil Winnie the Pooh? I wrote it down, but not every horror film is a metaphor.
I'm going to cop this from some of the reviews I saw in Letterboxd. Possibly a metaphor that some stories should keep their copyright.
I liked Evil Winnie the Pooh.
When I looked at Werner Herzog's Nosferatu, the copyright of Dracula ended in 1979. They started shooting the day that Dracula was public domain.
Nice.
Speaking of vampires, we're on to the last episode now. Like the 50s transformation movies, we're going to be talking about two subgenres here, and I'm interested in knowing how much you've seen of them. We're going to be looking at the monstrous femme, the vampire craze, not just 70s lesbian vampires, but also pre that and also post that. And then after that, we're talking about the 90s femme fatale craze, how Basic Instinct did very well, and then there was a slew of similar films of women killing, all that Venn diagram of women being dangerous and being sexual. Both of these, it's a whole episode about how feminism can be portrayed negative and positively.
I was a teenager when Basic Instinct came out, and it was notorious at my school. If you hadn't seen Basic Instinct underage, you weren't cool. And I hadn't seen Basic Instinct underage, and I wasn't cool. My brother and I were going on holiday on a ferry with my folks. They had little cinemas on the ferry. You had an adult film and a children's film, two little cinemas. The adult film kicked out just before the children's film, so you could collect your child. You didn't have any choice what the films were. So my brother and I went to see Hook. Mm-hmm. My mum and dad, with no clue what the film was about, and it was Basic Instinct.
That's a wild film just to go into.
My dad he's not sheltered. It wouldn't have shocked him, but my mum was fucking traumatised by the ice pick scene, which is very early on in that film. I don't think she even got to the infamous vagina, but she did not stay in that film. She sat outside while my brother and I were watching Hook. And they only told us that story years later after I mentioned Basic Instinct, that I'd seen it and don't watch it, Mom. And she was like, I've already seen it. And I was like, what?
That is a great example, though, of a lot of this. A lot of what this episode is covering. Basic Instinct, even for the unsheltered, is gratuitous to the point of it's almost an exploitation film. It kind of covers, not just this episode, but almost all of it, representation / exploitation.
Basic Instinct was so gratuitous, but Sharon Stone agreed to do it. It is essentially the same argument, the same problem as consensual pornography. Everyone that works in the right porn films wants to be in porn. They want to make money from the sexualization of their body. And similarly, obviously, Sharon Stone wanted that part. It changed her life. It kind of brought it even further into the mainstream, Basic Instinct, I think.
Oh, definitely. Like, yeah, for the whole thing with this, it's, going back to that quote, finding representation where you can. It's the 70s lesbian vampire films. They are made by men, for men. You're going to watch a film with some tits and blood. These films, these genres, they get reclaimed because people see themselves in them in a different way. These films are a real wild seesaw of feminist or misogynist, or both. Basic Instinct, if you look at similar films of that era, Fatal Attraction and Single White Female, the quote-unquote crazy women in those films are very much the antagonist. They are attacking the normal people. Basic Instinct, I want to say this was intentional because Paul Verhoeven does this in his films. They're very over-the-top satires of culture and society. The same thing happens with Basic Instinct. Maybe at the time, a lot of people were like, oh, Sharon Stone, she's sexy, but she's dangerous. I don't know if it's a modern viewing or this is how the film was meant to be, but when you watch the film, Michael Douglas is fucking insane in it.
Yes.
He is just as crazy as Sharon Stone, if not more. He is constantly flying off the handle. Fatal Attraction, which was also Michael Douglas. Yeah, sure, he did a bad thing. He cheated on his wife. Glenn Close is very much manipulating him and making the most of the situation. Whereas in this, Michael Douglas he's so horny. I do think a point there is the point. They literally call him Shooter because of a past incident where he accidentally shot someone. I do think Basic Instinct makes a point. He is just as crazy as she is, but I don't know, people view them differently because of their sex.
He didn't get his vagina out though, did he? And that's why people remember Sharon Stone as the psychopath more than anything.
He does get his arse out a few times. There's some very funny scenes where, I think there's one scene where he's wearing a sweater, but no pants.
Yeah, but you don't see his wang, do you? You can pause the footage. Not that I did. Okay, I did, to pretend I was straight. You can pause the footage and actually see Sharon Stone's vagina.
I feel like Verhoeven would want that, but I assume someone like Michael Douglas is willing to do a lot of things. These are very graphic sex scenes, but he probably didn't want to show his wang.
Right, I'm going to do a massive tangent, don't care. This is a massive episode and I can get away with it. I've been watching Dante's Cove. You know how I have my regular moan about how Americans' priorities of what can and can't be shown. There's a scene in Dante's Cove. A character is getting bummed. His female partner walks in on it and is not pleased. And then she casts a spell on the bloke who was bumming him. When she comes in, she says something along the lines of, "You absolute toe rag." It isn't toe rag, but it's something like that. And then when she casts the spell on him, the bloke with a semi-erect penis gyrates on the floor in pain and his willy goes all over the place. So she can't say cunt, but you can see a good 4 or 5 seconds of this bloke's willy helicoptering. Americans are crazy.
Well,
tangent over.
Yeah, I think maybe it was a sign of the time. I think it is more a sign of the times and the actors, because another femme fatale film, a more modern one, Gone Girl, Ben Affleck was willing to get his dick out. Very, very brief, but more kind of like Basic Instinct. Blink and you miss it. He does get his dick out in that.
Still a reason to go.
I don't think Rosamund Pike even gets nude in that film. So it's kind of a complete reversal. The male is more nude than the female in that.
I just find the whole priorities of what should be censored or what makes a film a adult film utterly bizarre. I don't think saying fuck or bugger is anywhere near as shocking as a penis being right there, right in front of you. I just don't. Talking about this, right? Susan Sarandon's tits. They put Susan Sarandon's tits in this documentary. I'd forgotten that we ever got to see Susan Sarandon's tits. Because it's such old footage. That's not how I see Susan Sarandon now. I see her as this kind of elder stateswoman kind of person, this well-respected female actor who's always in these films as a certain kind of presence.
You're way out of the Twitter circles then. She is a major mommy MILF on Twitter.
Oh, do you think that's why they put Susan Sarandon's tits into this documentary to embrace that meme?
It's a strong film for her. I mean, we didn't talk about it, but she was also in Rocky Horror as well. She's been in some very queer horror films. With the whole penis thing, I think it's just kind of like cinema language. It's very hard to show something like how much of Basic Instinct is meant to be titillation and overt porn. Like, it's very hard for a woman to be nude and it not to be sexual in some sense. Whereas generally people find penises funny. The idea of a penis flopping around is not overtly sexual. It's more comedic.
I find a naked man significantly more sexually arousing than a naked woman, so...
True, that's a good perspective, yeah.
I feel like, for the sake of equality, that's not true, even if that is what society says it is.
With penises, I guess my thoughts on it being comedic are there's two forms of penises, in a sense. That women are... When women are nude, there is a sense of vulnerability. That is their body. That's how it is. You can show a flaccid penis, but I think if a penis is erect, then that's a hard X. The censors are very hard on erect penises. That's why you never see that in films.
I was surprised by Dante's Cove, because he got a semi. He definitely got a semi. And he had just bummed a lad.
But yeah, the whole, I guess, female nudity. I know this is kind of a whole tangent from the queerness. But let's get back to queerness a bit more. Have you ever seen Mulholland Drive?
Yes, long time ago. Loved it. Utterly bizarre.
I love David Lynch. David Lynch loves the women. He very much does. Especially for his age, he loves younger women. There's a very funny interview. It's so weird. Like, it's like a German TV crew go to interview him. Like, he's making music. But he's making music in, like, literally, like, a cave or a sewer or something. It's like a 4-foot-high entrance into, like, a cave. David Lynch comes out. He's shirtless. He's, like, covered in mud. And he's just talking about, like, the music he's making. And then in the background, as he's talking, two shirtless women come out.
Good.
He's very in tune with his sexuality. In Mulholland Drive is very different than Basic Instinct.
Yes.
And they're similar, Verhoeven and Lynch, in a sense that you get the idea that they do love tits. In Mulholland Drive, it never feels sexualized because there are two lesbian scenes in it. They're very different, but neither of them feel this is for a straight audience. And it makes sense of the film because the first half of the film is a romanticized idea of this story happening, and then the second one is the hard, cold reality of a situation. And you get like a very romanticized lesbian sex scene where it's similar to Bound, and then in the second one you get it's not even sexual in any sense. It's like Naomi Watts, she's nude and she's grinding up against a woman. It's directed so coldly, it's actually like scary. Connecting it to Bound, because we've talked about how subtextual some of these stories are within these films, but these are films that are about lesbians, and it's rare still that you see well-made, positive lesbian representation.
True.
I haven't seen it. This is definitely a modern classic that I'm missing out on. Have you seen Jennifer's Body?
No.
The director of that is one of the guests on this, and so I did wonder if they were going to comment on that. Don't think the two leads in that, Megan Fox and Amanda Seyfried, I don't believe they are lesbians in that, but they are best friends. Jennifer, when she becomes this succubus, when she becomes a monster, she's feeding on boys. She threatens to kill her friend, and her friend is like, I thought you only killed boys. And she's like, well, I go both ways.
Yeah, that's just another film that I now want to see.
But yeah, that's another like hot button debate that happens nowadays. You know, like Bury the Gays and discussions like that. These days it feels like you can't, like in a horror film especially, like if you have a queer character and they don't survive, then it feels automatically like, oh, that's homophobic, isn't it? Why couldn't they live? And it's like, well, not everyone gets to live in a horror film.
No, exactly. I don't think that's true. I think we can like look at that in context of Chucky, actually. When David was killed in Bride of Chucky, that was not homophobic in any way, shape or form. In fact, it was, to me at least, more tragic that this very positive queer character died so brutally. It wasn't homophobic to kill him off. Yeah. It was done for shock value because the same way as it would have been with any sympathetic character.
But it is a thing people are grappling with now in terms of artistic people. If you're going to make it text, if you're going to include gay or trans characters, you still have to conform to the expectations of horror, in that they don't have to be gay horror or queer horror. It can still just be like, a slasher in the woods, like Jason. But like, you have to understand that if there's going to be more representation in terms of gay or trans characters, That doesn't mean they're immune.
No, exactly that, and they shouldn't be.
But do you think what makes, a lot of these films more talked about the subtext becoming text and stuff? Femme fatales or lesbian vampires and stuff. When Gone Girl came out, that was very much a different intentional recontextualization, an update to Basic Instinct, wherein the Rosamund Pike character is almost the good guy. She's still evil. Ben Affleck's character in that is more overtly shitty. And the film and the book contextualizes it as he is a shitty husband, and maybe he deserves some of this.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the vampires and such. This is kind of a section that I'm very much in the dark about.
Yeah, Vamp is batshit. Vamp is absolutely batshit crazy. It's one of those films that absolutely had to be looked at on my old horror podcast, Super Tat Film Club. It's so exploitative. It's so... I enjoyed it as a piece of history of what terrible tat films, but remarkably entertaining at the same time. Yeah, I loved Vamp.
Is there anything in terms of queer representation in any sense that you can talk about it in the full context of the film? Because literally all I know about this film is the whole Grace Jones dance sequence. And that is all they talk about. I don't know what the rest of the film is about.
I mean, you saw the scene in the documentary. It's just so iconic. Grace Jones is just iconic in everything. And she's just this incredible figure of sexuality and yet strangely androgynous, but also she's an enigma. She's an amazing... Yeah, that scene is probably the best thing about Vamp. They were right to highlight that. In my notes, I've written Grace Jones and drawn a love heart. That's all I needed.
That is a film case where the rest of the film isn't as interpretable or as deep.
Honestly, I'd have to watch it again.
Just Googling it. I'm looking at the plot. Order to fetch a stripper, fraternity pledges, try the After Dark Club, and meet a tall vampire. That is just how they describe Grace Jones. It's so vague and basic. They talk more about the two lesbians in Hunger, but that film also has David Bowie in it. The side-by-side of those two films, of David Bowie and Grace Jones being these very... we've talked about Frankenstein, we've talked about The Wolfman, we've talked about, like, trans-coded or gay-coded and stuff. But we haven't talked about much about androgyny, Bowie and Jones. It's less so that they've transitioned, more so they've ascended. They are something else entirely. I guess that's a way people do look at these when they relate in some shape or form to these films, even if they don't know how. Like Frankenstein, they don't want to be transitioned like Frankenstein. It's the otherness, isn't it? The outsider. They relate to that.
Of all the people to put in a film together, David Bowie and Grace Jones.
That would be cool. Yeah, I've got kind of a blind spot for the vampire movies of this era. These are two films I thought of similar. The Craft and Suspiria kind of fit this bill of, women claiming their otherness, finding their place. Suspiria, not so much about that reclamation, but they're both about witches, and this docuseries doesn't really touch upon witches in terms of feminism or queerness or anything like that.
No, it doesn't actually.
Certainly with The Craft, definite queer undertones to that. It really depends on the reader, isn't it? The viewer of the film. How it can either just be, these are four women who found each other, really depend on each other and find their strength. Or you can read into it a bit further,
Yeah, there is potential for a fifth episode looking at witches. Actually, thinking about it.
They're not transforming themselves, but they are tapping into a power, aren't they?
Yeah.
That makes them other. In Suspiria, you have to do a bit more reading. The main witches in that are definitely bad guys. The remake Suspiria actually plays with that a little bit. There are good and bad witches in that. But like The Craft, it's not black magic. It's not evil magic. It's like nature magic. It's a part of the world, everything around us. And these women are tapping into it. There is an ambiguous queerness to it. We all have this within us, this ability to explore ourselves.
It's another community aspect, isn't it? It's like a metaphor for a lesbian community as well.
Yeah, and you can definitely maybe make some points on the main girl in that. She goes out with Skeet Ulrich, and he was an asshole, which kind of caused the divide, but you could read into it like her straightness there kind of causes the divide between her and her gal pals.
Yeah.
There's another little interesting one I thought of 90s femme fatales. We've talked a lot about the exploitation or the gratuitousness of the female body, and how in the subtext of this, a lot of these directors can only explore women in terms of their bodies. One that I've definitely read reading on, contrast to the femme fatales, the book in the film Misery with Kathy Bates. There's a lot of reading into that in terms of stereotypes, that Kathy Bates is very butch in that. She's very quote-unquote manly in that. And there's a lot of reading into it that she possibly is similar to maybe Hitchcock or Patricia Highsmith, almost a self-hating gay, you know. So I don't have too much to say on that, but I think there's possibly other, just because of her dominance in that film, you could maybe relate her a bit more to the Wolfman or Frankenstein in terms of an imposing figure, especially over the main character, James Caan. You don't see butch women much in these films, do you?
No.
Like,
no.
you have that very side character, Roxanne, in Basic Instinct.
True.
She's like the most femme butch. She wears a leather jacket. That's about it.
Yeah, it's not fully committed, is it?
And that's something, yeah, maybe that's what modern films need to imply a bit much. You don't see women who just don't want to be as feminine, you know?
So I want to talk about the Hays Code, which was brought up in this episode. It really was fucking evil, wasn't it?
It did not help Hollywood in any way.
I think it contributed to how cinema has been more metaphorical when it comes to queer things. This kind of thing will always make me think of Section 28 in the UK. I'm still traumatized by Section 28. I genuinely believe that if that hateful bitch Margaret Thatcher hadn't implemented that, I would have had an easier life as a queer kid. I would have understood who I was, and I'd have been able to come out earlier than I did. It does feel like things like the Hays Code will have done some damage to queer people, like Section 28 did to an entire generation of gay people in this country.
Intentionally, oppression causes repression. It's very intentional on that side. And back to that Basic Instinct talk, I think cinema is all the better if they get to explore what they want to explore. I mean, yeah, you could say it's quite straight in that instance. Basic Instinct, you know, Mulholland Drive, even the 70s lesbian vampire films, go back to even the older topics like the age gap. You know, life is messy. A lot of people have messy lives. They deserve to be put on the screen and explored the way it is. If they're not explored, it is the first film or one of the first films to bring it up. It can get into that trigger-happy Twitter online debates of like, everything is a binary, good or bad. You know, oh, there's bad representation. It shouldn't exist. This story is happening because it reflects real life. Even if it's something as base as Basic Instinct, where like people love fucking, people like nudity, people like sex.
I like those things.
Yeah. That should be in cinema. It doesn't have to be in all cinema, but filmmakers should be able to put that in their films because it reflects parts of society.
Exactly that.
That really does a good summation of the entire point of this. These things need to be explored because we're at a very, I keep mentioning it, you know, subtext and text. We're at a very tough point still, where we're still getting good representation, we're still getting more representation. Whenever something becomes text, it has to be perfect text, or people want it to stay subtext. We need more discussion, and we need more examples so that they don't become the only example. They don't become the sole example to be on a pedestal. It gets an intensely scrutinized, critical look. We need to get past that and just have more films that represent people.
You were worried we weren't going to have much to talk about on this episode.
No. I never said not much. I meant just how messy it would be.
I don't envy you the edit, but I've had a nice chat.
We are wrapping up. I would say before we wrap up completely, not to go into a huge conversation, looking back at that Letterboxd list, or just looking back at the docuseries as a whole, what films have you seen in this docuseries that you really want to see now?
All the lesbian vampire stuff. I'm fascinated by that. I think I need to see more Hitchcock as well, and James Whale. Psycho 2, I really, really want to see. I think even some of the Universal monsters that I haven't seen. Oh, and cat people. Absolutely have to prioritise cat people, because two things. The whole concept really fascinates me, and I really like cats. What about you? What are you going to be starting to watch because of this?
A lot of the ones you've covered, I've seen. You know, I've seen the black and white Universal monster films. I haven't seen many of the vampire ones. Definitely would like to see a couple more Hitchcock films. Strangers on a Train and Rebecca.
Rebecca's one of my favourites of ever. I just think it's a great film. Last night I dreamt I went to Mandalay again.
The acting in that looks really good. And it definitely seems like that is weirdly a case where the older film seems to have more to it, because that Netflix film just came and went, didn't it? No one gave a shit about that one.
Have you seen Dead Calm?
I haven't, no.
You fucking should. Absolutely fantastic. Nicole Kidman's tits.
Yeah, some of those vampire ones look really interesting. There's a long list of vampire ones here. It's a shame I can't remember exactly which one it is, but if you watch the documentary, they really talk about that one about the older lesbian vampire, and then like the older blonde lady, and then the younger blonde lady. That one looks fascinating. I really want to see that one.
Looking at this again, I'm actually looking at the list now. I've not seen the Body Snatchers remake. I've only seen the original with, what's his name? Kiefer Sutherland's dad, Donald Sutherland.
Oh, well, that's the second one.
Oh, is it?
The black and white. There's a black and white one from the 50s.
Oh, is there a third one?
Well, there's 4 actually. There's the 90s.
Oh, okay.
There's the 90s one, which has Meg Tilly, and then there was this one really came and went. I think it was just called Invasion, and it had like Daniel Craig in it and Naomi Watts.
Okay,
that was like
never even heard of
2008, and that one just came and went because I don't really know if that film had much to say about the society at that time. I have seen the black and white Cat People. That's a really good film. But I have not seen the remake, and I hear that is really good. It just gets a lot more into the sensuality of it.
Okay.
That was a film that looked really good, that I have not seen. I'm aware of it, but I've never got around to it. Heavenly Creatures by Peter Jackson.
It's a great film.
Yeah, it
Love that
looked
film.
amazing. Like, I knew what the plot was about based on the real events. I did not know how visually stunning it was.
I went through a phase of watching all of the Peter Jackson films, but before Lord of the Rings, actually. A friend of mine was really into him when he was kind of unknown. It was just after he'd released Frighteners. So I watched all of the Peter Jackson films in one go, like Bad Taste and Brain Dead. Meet the Feebles is an interesting one, that's for sure.
Yeah. You know, weirdly, I've seen all of those wacky horrors. I think this is probably one of his only films I haven't seen. And especially now, like, Kate Winslet's been famous for years. Everyone knows Kate Winslet. But Melanie Linsky is huge now between Yellow Jackets and The Last of Us. Like, everyone knows how good she is. And she looked fantastic in this. Yeah, so those are definitely some missed gems that me and Mark want to see and will definitely be catching in the near future. And of course, if this long podcast episode hasn't interested you yet, we simply must implore you to give this docuseries a go. It's in depth, but it never feels academic. It's not like you're digging into like a textbook. It's fun to watch. There's so many good examples of different films that will pique your interest.
It just gets it right.
Yeah, you'll definitely learn a lot. And then you'll want to see a lot of these movies. If you haven't seen them, you'll want to watch them. And that's great. And I hope we've done the same thing. By talking about Quaver Fair, I hope we've piqued your interest into giving it a go. So that has been our bonus bumper episode of Chucky Vision. Do we know what we're doing next?
Yeah, we're going to take a look at Magic next, which is a film that inspired the original Child's Play film. It's got a killer doll in it, so we're doing some actual killer doll shit. Go us.
A killer doll and Anthony Hopkins, isn't it? And another horror film.
I know, right?
A lot of people have probably seen Hannibal, but how many people have seen Magic? It's a very, I wouldn't say underrated, because it's rated perfectly by people who've seen it, but it's meant to be, a real missed gem.
I'm looking forward to it. I've never seen it before.
Fantastic. I haven't seen it before. A joy for both of us. As always, you can find us at CHUCKYVISION on Twitter. You can find me at Absolute Travesty. There's not much going on, so you can follow me if you want. Mark, where can they find you?
They can find me at Mark Adams HC, and you know about my other podcast. It's about Red Dwarf at Red Dwarf Pod. If you want. If you don't, that's also okay.
Fantastic. We'll be talking about all things horror, all things queer, maybe all things Chucky. But until then, wanna play?
Chucky Vision is a podcast brought to you by the We Made This Network. Follow us on Twitter at CHUCKYVISION. Follow the network on Twitter at WMT_network. Our website is WeMadeThisNetwork.com. The logo was designed by Carl Bryan, and the theme tune composed by Dark Fantasy Studios. Wanna play?
If I asked you to think about Japanese movies, what do you picture? Anime, no doubt. You think of the beautifully rendered works of Studio Ghibli. Maybe you picture Godzilla and his coterie of city-ravaging kaiju. Perhaps you see Toshido Mifune wandering the countryside and armed with only his wit and his blade. And I know you're trying not to think about the pale-faced ghost with long hair and creepy noises. And maybe you're a fan of the exploitation type of cinema, where schoolgirls wield chainsaws and machine guns with abandon. My name's Perry Constantine. I'm an author and a teacher, and back when I was in college, I had the exact same image of Japanese films as you did. It was my love and interest in these movies that led me to move to Japan. Now, almost 20 years later, I'm still here and teaching classes about Japanese film. What I've learned in that time is that Japanese movies are so much more diverse than just anime or kaiju or samurai. Sure, those movies are fun, but by exploring the wide range of Japanese cinema, there's so much we can learn about Japanese history, society, and culture. That's why I started Japan on Film. In each episode, I'm joined by a different guest to help me spotlight just some of these excellent movies. We'll be watching the good, the bad, the popular, and the bizarre. Come along with us on a journey into the wide, wonderful, and sometimes very weird world of Japanese cinema. Listen to the Japan on Film podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and visit our website, japanonfilm.com.